Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qi Zhi. Coming up in this edition, China and Brazil have signed nearly 40 cooperation documents during the Chinese president's state visit. UN Security Council members have criticized the United States for again vetoing a draft resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And Ukraine has launched its first volley of British Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russia after firing long-range American weapons inside Russian territory. We begin in South America. China and Brazil have signed nearly 40 cooperation documents during the Chinese president's state visit. The deals cover areas from trade to aerospace. Dan Williams has the details.
A key element of this state visit was the announcement of these 37 different trade agreements, and they go across a whole range of different industries, from tourism to agriculture, technology, film, energy, education. We've also seen the creation of synergies as these two countries move closer together between China's Belt and Road Initiative along with Brazil's development strategies as well. And there was also a declaration of a joint formation of a China-Brazil community, of a shared future for a fairer world and a more sustainable planet. So pointing at different ways that the two economies can find greener ways for a sustainable economy, and putting also an emphasis, of course, on the global south and their developing economy.
That was Dan Williams. Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping has described the Sino-Brazilian ties as an example of unity and cooperation between major developing countries. He was speaking after talks with his Brazilian counterpart in Brasilia. The two leaders reached a new strategic consensus on the future of China-Brazil relations. Wu Lei has more from Brasilia.
President Lula has emphasized the importance of the China-Brazil relations, and he said the two countries has had very fruitful cooperation over the past 50 years in trade, investment, and cultural. And now the two countries hope to expand the cooperation. And he emphasized the energy transition several times. We have been hearing this very often, and he said the two countries would expand the cooperation in clean energy, renewable, and also he wants to have a collaboration with China, especially on AI, digital economies, artificial intelligence. And President Xi Jinping said this is his fifth visit to Brazil. And Brazil has become the country in Latin America that he visited the most times. And he's very happy to have bilateral meetings with President Lula. And the two countries has very fruitful collaboration over the past 50 years. And he also quoted from the football star Pelé that the most beautiful goal is always the next one. So the most fruitful collaboration will be expected between China and Brazil. And many believe that President Xi's state visit will enhance this kind of relations, ushering a new golden 50 years. And two countries hope to enhance this kind of collaboration.
That was Wu Lei on the Chinese president's state visit to Brazil. On the Middle East, UN Security Council members have criticized the United States for again vetoing a draft resolution that calls for a ceasefire in Gaza. The draft demands an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, as well as the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The US is the only Security Council member to vote against it. Jody Jacobs reports from New York.
While 14 Security Council members voted in favor of this latest ceasefire resolution, the United States voted against it. The US blocked the measure, claiming it would only support a legally binding document that explicitly calls for the immediate release of all hostages. This was the 12th time since the war began that the Security Council voted on a resolution about the Israel-Hamas conflict in Gaza. Only 4 have been passed. Israel thanked the United States for vetoing the resolution. It says this latest measure is nothing short of a betrayal of innocent hostages still being held by Hamas. But Security Council members across the board have criticized the United States, with China saying history will be the judge. It says Israel has flagrantly breached every red line of international humanitarian law with its actions. Yet the US always seems to be able to find a justification to defend it.
The US claims to be conducting parallel diplomatic efforts. and has repeatedly promised that progress would be made soon in the negotiations. It is incomprehensible then why, to date, the so-called diplomatic negotiations has seen no progress. Why is Israel allowed to continue its military operations while consistently putting forth new conditions for negotiations? In the future, when looking back, people will find it inevitable to feel indignant.
The United Nations reports that people in northern Gaza are facing diminishing conditions for survival. It says attempts to deliver humanitarian aid to the area have either been denied or impeded, leaving millions on the brink of starvation. UN Security Council members say they will be returning to the negotiating table and search for other ways to bring an end to the conflict and the suffering in Gaza.
That was Jody Jacobs at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Turning to Europe, Ukraine has reportedly fired its first volley of British Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russia. This comes one day after Ukrainian forces launched US long-range missiles. Britain had previously allowed Ukraine to use Storm Shadows within Ukrainian territory. However, London has yet to confirm if it permitted Kyiv to fire the long-range weapons into Russia. Meanwhile, Russia has vowed to respond if Kyiv is allowed to use long-range missiles against Russian territory. Dasha Chernysheva reports from Moscow.
Well, indeed, Moscow believes that there is the general line and the tendency of the outgoing American administration to escalate the situation, to add more oil to the fire, and Russia insists that it will respond to any attempt by the Ukrainian side or the Western side to attack Russia's sovereign territory. Now, we haven't had any confirmation with regard to the Storm Shadow missiles. However, there have been several media reports about that as well in the Russian media. We have seen the attack by the Ukrainians' armed forces against Russia's Bryansk region, where the ATACMS missiles were used, and Moscow has updated its nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the possible use of nuclear weapons. Moscow insists that it is still open for any sort of negotiations with the Ukrainian side, however, and with the American side, but it does know that Russia's concerns will have to be met, and Russia insists that freezing the conflict along the confrontation line is not an option for Moscow at the moment. Speaking about the possibility of attack against Kyiv and the warnings from the embassies, we have heard the Kremlin saying that it is the prerogative of the Russian Ministry of Defense to define the course of the operation, because indeed many political analysts and military experts here have been saying that one of the likely scenarios at this moment would be that Moscow would escalate its strikes against Ukraine to demilitarize the country and to minimize the threat from the Ukrainian side.
That was Dasha Chernysheva reporting. Finally, the U.S. Pacific Northwest and West Coast are experiencing a severe weather pattern known as a bomb cyclone. California weather authorities have issued high wind warnings. Meteorologists warned of potential flooding and landslides. Mark New has more from Northern California.
I'm in the city of Palo Alto in Northern California, where wind gusts are starting to pick up and heavy rain in the forecast. The Pacific Northwest has taken the brunt of the severe weather pattern. Intense winds swept across the states of Oregon and Washington, knocking out power to more than 500,000 homes. Falling trees have also struck homes and littered roads. Fire officials said that in Bellevue, just east of Seattle, a woman died when a tree fell onto her home, while another woman died when a large tree fell on a homeless encampment. The severe weather pattern is known as a bomb cyclone, which is defined as a low-pressure system rapidly intensifying by 24 millibars within 24 hours. The atmospheric river-fueled storm is also hitting parts of Northern California, bringing torrential rain, snow, and perhaps most worrisome, high winds. The bomb cyclone is expected to cause significant flash flooding and landslides. The heavy rains in California are expected to last at least through next week.
That was Mark New on the extreme weather in the United States. Now recapping the headlines, China and Brazil have signed nearly 40 cooperation documents during the Chinese president's state visit to Brazil. UN Security Council members have criticized the United States for again vetoing a draft resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And Ukraine has reportedly launched its first volley of British Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russia after firing long-range American weapons inside Russian territory. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Xi Zhi. Thanks for listening.